conferences and declarations and stuff like that. But it says, when we acknowledge the magnitude of the victims, the geographic scope, right? The entire world, the duration, centuries, which now comes to define an epoch, the commodification, state and corporate participation, the deliberate dehumanization of enslaved Africans, and the racialized chattel enslavement of Africans produce such enduring global consequences, including the large-scale destruction of African societies, the demographic re-engineering of continents, and the entrenchment of racialized inequalities that continue to structure international relations, thereby warranting recognition of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery as the gravest crime against humanity. So all that's just like one part of a 7-page document, but that paragraph right there is saying that the history of it, the geography of it, the depth of it, all of that transformed the world. So when we talk about reparations, we're talking about something that has to repair and set the world right back on course, as if African people can now determine its future, and it has to change the relationship of African people to other people in the world. And to me, I came in with a heavy expectation that we would get into that. And to me, and this is why I say it's a conference, and I think our emphasis here tonight is understanding that it is a conference, and the real motion comes from us in this room, because a conference is often about diplomacy, right? How do we speak to people in formal ways and stuff like that? And if the stage has not been set for a swell of people on the ground for the conference to respond to, then you have to question certain things. So this idea that this was a Pan-African conference and that reparations would be discussed, it's significant that the AU hosted it. It was in Ghana, and of course, CARICOM, as Roger said, had a big part to do with it, but it's also significant that, you know, we representing D12, we came in with an idea that we have an agenda. We have something to discuss about what's happening in the US, but also what we see is happening in the rest of the world. So our definition of Pan-Africanism, our idea of reparations, that's what we wanted to push forward. And I'll stop there and allow Deja to touch on it, and then we'll go back and forth. But it raises some very critical questions about our role in what was happening in Accra. And this was mainly an African Union framing of reparations based on the document, and our continued correspondence or conversation with what happens with reparations have to come from some idea that we're going to have more input.
Yeah, and I think to the point that Jonathan made about, or in the document itself, sort of pulling apart what Walter Rodney does thorough research on in terms of how Europe underdeveloped Africa, that this entire civilization was developed from extraction of resources, extraction of labor of African people throughout the diaspora. So in terms of the remaking of the modern world, or the repair of the modern world, or identifying that this gravest crime is part of the rot of the modern world, I think it's the basis of the economic system that we're talking about. And in terms of what the heads of state identified as an urgent need for development in their countries, in their respective nations, and we also have the analysis that the development of our own communities throughout the diaspora here in Brooklyn, Harlem, the right to healthcare, the right to housing, these are aspects of our development that are at stake, or that suffer as a result of the economic system that was built as a result of the gravest crime against humanity. So in terms of talking about the next step to development, or the next steps, that reparations in terms of undoing that underdevelopment was the nature of the argument that was being made. And we can get into some of the presentations by the keynote speakers. The keynote speakers were essentially what was decided to be the global advisory panel. So they identified heads of state, the president of Namibia, Ndani Naitwa, and Prime Minister Mia Mottley, the President of Senegal, the President of Liberia, the former Vice President of Costa Rica, and I think the President of Sao Tome and Principe, that these were the global advisory panel. This was the leadership that was coming out of the conference in terms of moving the next steps forward. So there were the keynote speakers, and then we also heard from foreign ministers, ministers of trade from all different nations: Zimbabwe, Brazil, Gambia. There were a lot of representatives who were speaking in support of the conference or in support of the declaration, and expressing that they wanted to be a part of the next steps. But not everybody was represented, so that also required some assessment of who's here and who's not here, as it relates to the African Union and CARICOM as well. But I'll just play this.
Just before you play, it may not be clear. This conference, Durban Declaration, UN resolution, is just paper. It's things that people aspire to. The question is then, how does it get implemented? So this conference was set up as next steps in terms of taking steps to implement the resolution. So that's what this, so you have the context within which this is happening.
Right.
Lights.
June 24th, 2026.
This is the president